Okay, so let's just do some simple data binding here. I have got a blank Silverlight application, and imagine that I want to just bind to some properties on a simple .NET class. So I walk up to this application, we'll add a new class into it. Let's call this class person, something like that. So we have person.c#, and into that class all I'm going to do is put some simple properties. We'll have something like a string, which is going to be for first name. We'll have a property string, we'll have last name, and we'll have a property integer, which we'll have as age. And we'll go back to our page, and onto our page we have a grid already. So into this grid I'm just going to put some rows and columns. So let's have grid.rows, row definitions, and we'll just put rows into there. And what I'm going to do is just have, let's say, 6 rows in there, something like that. That looks like about 6 to me. And then we'll have some columns, grid.columns definitions, and into that we'll have a column, and that definition we'll just copy, so we have 2 columns. And on the grid, let's just go and show the grid lines so that we can see what's actually happening up there on that grid. So we've divided up our UI to give us some space. And I'm just going to throw in some labels and text boxes. So into our grid here we will throw in some text blocks. And the text block, I'm going to put this one into, well, it just falls into that first one, and we'll say text equals first name, something like that. And then we'll have another one which will say text equals last name, and we'll have one more which is going to say text equals age, something like that. And I need to move these into different rows. So let's say grid.row equals 1, let's say grid.row equals 2, and those move down like that. Let's copy all of those things that we just did, those 3 text blocks. I'm going to paste them in again. And where we paste them in again, what I'm going to do is just move them down to grid rows 3, 4, and 5. So we've, whoops, I got that wrong. So let's move this one into grid.row equals 3, that one into 4, and that one into 5. To 4 and into 5. Let's just lay out that XAML so it looks a bit better. So we got a little bit of a UI building up on the right hand side. And then what I'm going to do on this other side, in the other column, is just put some text boxes. So we will go and put some text boxes in there. So let's say text box. And what we'll do is put into that one that the text equals, and we'll data bind this, we'll data bind it to the property called first name. Notice that we don't say where that's coming from, which is really quite neat. And I need to go and put that into the right grid.column equals 1 and move it over there. And now we've got our text box. So I'm going to put some more in there, so let's just paste 3, 4, 5, 6, lay out the XAML again, and I'm just going to change so that we've got different bindings here. We'll have last name. That go into grid.row 1. We'll have age, which is going to go into grid.row 2, and we'll have, once again, I'm going to bind again for first name, which will go into grid.row equals 3, I think we're up to. We'll take the last name again, we'll put that into grid.row equals 4, and finally we got one more binding of age, and we'll put that into grid.row equals 5. So, we've managed to build up a UI, and if we just scale that up a little bit, you see we've got first name, last name, age, first name, last name, age. Notice that in the XAML we don't say necessarily, we could if we wanted to, but we don't say necessarily anything to do with where these controls are going to get their data from. What controls do in Silverlight applications is that any control can have a thing called a data context, and if it has a data context it will look to that context to provide its data. So in our case it's going to look for a property called first name and last name. If it doesn't have a data context it looks to its parent to have a context. So we have a grid in here called layout root. So I'm going to give that a data context, and the way I'll do it here is by just saying that in our code behind the page what we'll do is we will go and say that when this UI is loaded, let's just go and do that, we will create a new person. So we'll say person P equals new person, and into that we'll put our first names, Mike, last name, Talty, say age, only 21 years old today, and we'll say that the layout root, which is the grid, has a data context, and that's going to be that person P. And so we've done some data binding there, and if we go and press F5 on this project, we should be able to see that the controls display our data. Let's just let debugging fire in. And our UI should spring up. It's not the world's most exciting UI, but you can see that we are displaying the data that was bound onto the screen. Now the interesting thing about this, if we go and grab one of these text boxes here and say foo and press tab, absolutely nothing happens. If we say bar and press tab, nothing is happening. So interestingly, these fields down here are not updating to reflect the values up there. The reason for this, well, the first reason for it is that the way we've built our person class, it's not actually telling Silverlight about changes to its properties. So let's re-implement this. Let's change this so that it does that. We're going to implement an interface called iNotifyPropertyChanged. This has been around in the .NET framework for quite a long time. Let's go and resolve that namespace, and let's go and implement it. And essentially all you have to do to implement this interface is implement this event called PropertyChanged. And you're responsible for telling people when your properties have changed, so that they can respond to them. And frameworks like Databinding really need this kind of stuff. So what we'll do is, instead of having these properties quite as simple as this, we'll make them more complete properties. I'll add a private member here. We'll call it fire property changed. Take the string name of the property that's going to change, and we'll say if property change is not equal to null, then we'll fire that event from this object with, let's use a new property event changed args, and on that we'll fire the property name, which is the one that we just got passed. So just a convenience method essentially. And then what we can do is have public string first name. I'm going to have, we're going to have get and set on that. And let's have some private storage for that, so let's just call that first name, and we'll say first name equals value. And at this point here we're going to fire property changed of first name, because that property's just changed, and here we're just going to return first name. And we'll go ahead and do the same thing with the other properties that we've got. So I'll just make a quick last name property. Let's just change that to a last name. Let's change that to our last name. Same thing over here, making sure that we fire the right property change notification. One of the great risks of copying and pasting pieces of code. And we'll do it again for age. So we'll have integer, we'll have age, we'll have a private member called age, we'll set it there, we'll fire the right notification, we'll have age there. And so we've been more explicit about this property implementation now, and we've got this property change notification. Let's go build. Whoops, looks like we've got some integers and strings on there. Age should really be an integer, so let's go and cast that up, or rather change the type. And let's press F5 and run this thing, and see what we've got now. So we're back, and we've got the UI on the screen. Let's change this to Fred. Okay, interesting. Change that to Smith, change that to 22. Still nothing much going on here in either direction, which is a bit disappointing because I thought that we'd made that work. But we've still got another step that we need to do. So to illustrate that, let's go back to our page.xaml, and let's put a simple button on here. So I guess the easiest way to do that is just to wrap a stack panel or something around our grid. So we'll just put a stack panel around the grid, and then onto the stack panel we'll add a button, and we'll just say content equals click me, something like that, and we'll say that click equals on click. And we'll just pop into our code that lives behind this file. That's a XAML file here. We'll write an event handler. I have a little one on a snippet here, so we can just say on click. And when that gets clicked, let's just set a breakpoint here, int x equals 10, and we'll run down to that piece of code. Because we know right now that when we are changing things here, like let's change this to Fred and then press the click button, if we have a look at the data context, let's just go and get a debug window here, let's just go and get the watch window. If we have a look at layout root dot data context, we can see that it's a person, and we can see that none of these values here have been changed. Let's change this value here to Jim, and let's let the code run on, and you'll spot that the UI is updated with Jim. So clearly what's happening is when we change values using the object model, they're being reflected on the screen, but they're not going from the screen to the object model. We're doing one-way data binding essentially. So let's stop debugging. So let's pop back to the XAML file, and let's change these bindings to add a comma mode equals two-way. And we'll just go and copy that and paste it onto, paste it onto each one of these things. And so now we're doing two-way binding on this rather than one-way binding. If I got all of those, let's press F5. And hopefully we can see, let's now change this to Fred. Hit Tab, we can see that updates. Let's change this one back to Mike. Go the other direction, it updates. Let's change this to 25. It updates. Let's change this to 18. It updates. Let's change this to Smith. It updates. If we were also, we can see now that the changes are definitely going from the UI into the object model and back from the object model to the UI, because we know that these two things are both bound to the same piece of data, so that when we change something there, it pops up over here. So we know that we've now got full two-way data binding going on through that person class that lives behind this. And the nicest thing about it is that the UI really says very little about where the data comes from. So there's a high degree of separation really between the UI and the definition of that and the actual data classes.